Okay, in today's session, I'm going to talk about commas and a little bit about semicolons, but mostly commas. There are a lot of comma rules, and I can't cover them all in one video, but I'm going to cover the 5 places where it seems most frequently implicated in legal writing. So here are 5 comma rules I want you to remember from this video. You need commas after introductory material to set off interrupting phrases and transitions, to separate independent clauses, when you have a list of 3 or more items, and to set off non-restrictive phrases. I'll make a pitch for the Oxford comma at part 4. So you need commas after introductory material. These phrases and clauses tell the reader that the main point of the sentence is coming next. So in each of these introductory phrases, I'm introducing the core content in the sentence. According to Professor Frost, the Great British Baking Show is terrific. The core content there is that the Great British Baking Show is terrific. That introductory text is set off by a comma. If you want to watch it, several seasons are still available on Netflix. If I were to voice one concern about the bakers, it would be that they overuse passion fruit. So each of those examples has introductory material that should be set off with a comma. Now, there's always an exception to the rule. When the introduction is very brief, a comma is optional. So by very brief, I mean 3 words or fewer. So either of these examples could be correct. After class, you can ask me for more examples, or after class, comma, you can ask me for more examples. Just as a general rule, when in doubt as to whether omitting the comma after that brief introductory material will cause confusion, include it. So in this example, without the comma, before eating the children had to wash their hands could cause your reader just a moment of concern. They'll figure it out by the end, right, that the children are not being eaten, but including the comma resolves that confusion from the start. The second rule is that commas set off interrupting phrases. So an interrupting phrase is a group of words that interrupts the flow of a sentence. Sometimes these can be set off by dashes instead of commas. If the word is added information and not crucial to the sentence, the word or words, then it can be set off by the commas. So these examples, Masterclass, which is Professor Tippett's favorite part of the series, features Paul and Mary baking, right? The which is Professor Tippett's favorite part of the series is an interrupting phrase. It adds information to the sentence, but if you removed it, the core content of the sentence remains the same. Masterclass features Paul and Mary baking. I just wanted to add in that Professor Tippett likes it best. Mary and Paul, with their expert knowledge and skills, show the viewer how baking is really done. Right? So each of these examples has an interrupting phrase that can be set off by commas, or, if not wanting to use commas, dashes. In each of these examples, right, just to illustrate it, you could take the middle part out, that interrupting phrase, without changing the meaning of the sentence. That's a sign that you've got yourself an interrupting phrase. So commas also set off transitional phrases. Anytime you see one of these words or phrases at the beginning of a sentence, it should be followed by a comma. However, therefore, for example, clearly, additionally, on the other hand. These are not the only phrases, so phrases like them might also be followed by a comma. The third rule I'm going to talk about is separating independent clauses with coordinating conjunctions. We got to get a little bit grammatical here. So an independent clause, just by way of reminder, is a clause that has a subject and a verb and can stand on its own. It could be its own sentence. A dependent clause, by contrast, can't. It's missing some part of the sentence, right, so that it cannot stand on its own. When you have a coordinating conjunction, to go into that sort of same review space, would be the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So these are the linking words that link sentences together. Coordinating conjunctions are these magic words that sort of stick two ideas together. When you see one of these coordinating conjunctions, it means you need to do a comma check. If you have 2 independent clauses on either side, meaning that they could be complete or stand alone sentences on either side, then you need a comma. When you don't have 2 independent clauses on either side of the coordinating conjunction, you don't need a comma, right? So if you have an independent clause on one and a dependent clause on the other, no comma. So here are some examples. The show is fun to watch and I learn about baking. The coordinating conjunction is and. I have 2 independent clauses on either side. The show is fun to watch. I learn about baking. Both could stand on their own, so you need a comma to separate them. The things they bake are complicated but look delicious. But is the coordinating conjunction. I have an independent clause on one side. The things they bake are complicated, but I have a dependent clause on the other side. Look delicious. That's not a standalone phrase. Similarly, The bakers are all amateur, but are highly skilled. The bakers are all amateur is independent, are highly skilled is not. You don't use a comma before because, even if there are two independent clauses on either side. So here, Paul asked them to bake a ciabatta because it requires careful technique. You have two independent clauses. Paul asked them to bake a ciabatta. It requires careful technique. But it's not one of the fanboys, it's the word because. You don't need a comma. Similarly, Mary was impressed by Tamal's cake because she had never been able to create a perfect chocolate collar herself. Two independent clauses, but they're separated by because, so there's no comma. So to review this rule, there's no comma when you have a dependent clause and an independent clause that flank the coordinating conjunction. The landscapes are lovely and look like the setting of a Jane Austen novel. No comma. You don't have a comma when the clauses are separated by a because. The show is dangerous because it makes you want to eat lots of cake. Two independent clauses, no comma, because it's not a coordinating conjunction. But yes, comma, when you say something like, I'm running out of things to write about the show, but I must keep going. Both sides of the coordinating conjunction have an independent clause. When you don't have the coordinating conjunction and you just have two independent clauses that are being separated, if you put a comma in there, you end up with a comma splice. So she wanted to stop talking about television. The topic had become tiresome. Two independent clauses separated by a comma, no coordinating conjunction, no good. Here's another example. Even Paul and Mary would be disgusted at this point. They'd think I'd taken this too far. They shouldn't be separated by a comma. You should use a period, right? Or go crazy with a semicolon. Or add in a coordinating conjunction if it works. So here's where I'll make a pitch for the Oxford comma. When you have lists of 3 or more items, you need a comma. An Oxford comma helps to clear up the confusion. So an Oxford comma is also known as a serial comma. I've had many a debate with law students about the Oxford comma, but there are certainly instances where it changes the meaning or at least clarifies the meaning to include it. So we've all seen this sort of classic example, kind of a joke, right? I'm inspired by my parents, Elton John and Britney Spears. Without the comma, arguably, the sentence says that my parents are Elton John and Britney Spears. I should be so lucky, right? But there are sort of more serious implications in legal writing for commas. So here's an example in estate planning. I leave all my property in equal shares to David, Jim, Katie, and Mary. Without the Oxford comma, what's going to happen? David and Jim are going to argue that Katie and Mary share 1/3 of a share. So there's a third to David, a third to Jim, and a third to Katie and Mary. Putting the Oxford comma back in clarifies that in fact it's meant in quarter shares. 1/4 to David, 1/4 to Jim, 1/4 to Katie, and 1/4 to Mary. When you have just 2 items, you don't need a comma. So if you just said a tiny home is a vehicle and a dwelling, there's 2 items in the list, vehicle and dwelling, no comma. The 5th rule is that commas are used to set off non-restrictive phrases. So a non-restrictive phrase, to get grammatical again, is non-essential information. It can be removed without changing the meaning of the sentence. This is sort of like the interrupting phrases from earlier slides. The word which can be a red flag that you have a non-restrictive phrase. A restrictive phrase means it's essential information. If you remove it from the sentence, it changes the sentence's meaning altogether. That is a red flag word for restrictive phrases. So here are some examples. My car that is black is covered in ash versus my car, which is black, is covered in ash. In the first one, that is black is restrictive information. It's identifying which car among my fleet is covered in ash. Not my red car, not my brown car, but my black car. In the second one, the information is non-restrictive. I just want you to know that I have a black car. But the most important part of the sentence is that it's covered in ash. The rest is just sort of extra information. If you took out which is black, the core content of the sentence remains the same. My car is covered in ash. Because it's a non-restrictive phrase, it should be offset by commas. The second example does the very same thing. The lawyer who filed his brief late was reprimanded. So the intent of this sentence, without commas, is to indicate that the lawyer who filed his brief late is the one who was reprimanded, as opposed to other lawyers who hadn't filed their briefs late. In the second sentence, the core content is that the lawyer was reprimanded. The author or the writer just wants you to know that lawyer had also filed his brief late. Because it's non-restrictive information, it's set off by commas. The writer's intent here is what dictates non-restrictive from restrictive. Is the clause intended to be extra information, or is it essential? So as a writer, try taking it out to see what the meaning would be. It probably depends a little bit on the surrounding context. Just a quick note about semicolons. In non-grammar terms, you use a semicolon when you want something longer than a pause, but not a full stop. Typically, a semicolon replaces a period as opposed to a comma. But it can replace commas when you have a list with complicated items, particularly if some of the items in the list have their own commas. A semicolon in those cases helps to distinguish parts of the list from their subparts. So here's an example. I assisted with trial preparation, interviewed prospective clients, prepared memoranda, client letters, and letters to opposing counsel, and assisted clients with billing inquiries. Using semicolons there makes that third item clearer, prepared memoranda, client letters, and letters to opposing counsel, which is supposed to be one unified part of a list. Semicolons are used to link two independent clauses that are closely related, so sometimes you want to show the close relation with a semicolon as opposed to a period. Some take notes on a laptop, others use a pen and a paper. Note that in this example, a period would have also worked. You also use semicolons to link sentences that are connected by conjunctive adverbs and transitional phrases. So when you have those however, therefore, or unfortunately's that arise in the midst of a sentence, it should be preceded by a semicolon and followed by a comma. Many people read on screens semicolon. However, research suggests our reading comprehension drops. Research also just suggests there's a typo on this slide. If you want more information about commas and semicolons, I recommend you read the relevant chapters of Beyond the First Draft. There's also an Aspen handbook for legal writers, which is pretty helpful and contains these rules for commas, among others. You can also feel free to ask me. I'm happy to talk to you about commas and other punctuation at any time.